Hi, I'm Bob. Welcome to Bob's Movie Facts. And here are 10 amazing facts about Star Trek, the motion picture. On December 7th, 1979, it was finally happening. After 10 years since the cancellation of the TV show, Star Trek was returning to the big screen with all of our favorite heroes. William Shatner as Captain James T. Kirk, or rather Admiral James T. Kirk, Leonard Nimoy as Spock, DeForest Kelley as Dr. Leonard McCoy, Uhura, Sulu, Chekhov, Scotty. They were all reuniting on the big screen. In this video, I'm going to talk about 10 incredible facts about how this movie almost didn't make it to the big screen. Fact number 1, Star Trek the Motion Picture started out as a TV show. In April 1978, Paramount Television announced a bold new plan to create a television network that would challenge the big three TV networks. It would be called Paramount Television Service. Paramount was quite serious about this and wanted a new Star Trek TV series that would be the flagship of this network. In June 17, 1977, Paramount Television announced that it was launching a new TV series called Star Trek Phase 2. Phase 2 would simply be the continuing adventures of the USS Enterprise, the second 5-year mission. Legendary writer Alan Dean Foster wrote the pilot episode called In Thy Image, where a massive godlike entity heads toward Earth looking for its creator, Ensa, and the Enterprise will be sent to intercept it. In the end, this massive being would turn out to be a long-lost probe that found a machine planet who gave it a massive body, and Kirk would clean off the sign which would reveal a missing A, revealing that the probe came from NASA. You can see how this idea influenced the idea of Voyager being the Voyager probe. Writer Harold Livingston was hired as head screenwriter to turn Alan Dean Foster's story into a working screenplay. Production began, and 13 episodes were scripted. The actors from McCoy, Scotty, Uhura, Sulu, and Chekhov all returned. William Shatner was expected to return, but Paramount expected a tough negotiation. He was the only actor who had a successful career, and therefore he had some Hollywood cachet to throw around. The producers created a Kirk-like commander named Will Decker, who could easily step into Captain Kirk's chair in case William Shatner's negotiations did not go well and he demanded too much money. Leonard Nimoy refused to return as Spock over his dispute with Paramount over the use of his image in advertising. In 1976, Heineken released an ad where Spock's ears are droopy, but when he drinks a beer, they perk up. Nimoy did not approve this, earned no money from it, and found the ad offensive and demeaning. He tried to sue the advertising agency, leading to a prolonged dispute with Paramount. He was unlikely to return. Paramount created a new Vulcan character named Zahn, played by David Gattro, and Zahn was a Vulcan who admired humans and volunteered to serve in Starfleet in order to learn about human emotions to become more like them. A third new character, Lieutenant Ilia, rounded up the new cast. Ilia was a psychic empath from the planet Delta who had a pre-existing relationship with Commander Decker. A decade later, Gene Roddenberry will use Decker, Ilia, and Zahn and transfer their characters into the character of William Riker, Deanna Troi, and Data. Riker is a Kirk-like chief commanding officer, while Troi is a psychic empath from the planet Beta Z who had a pre-existing relationship with Riker. Data would be an android devoid of human emotions who hopes to become more human. You can see the similarities. Star Trek Phase 2 was ready to go until something very unexpected happened in 1977. Star Wars had been released earlier that year, and Paramount executives dismissed it as a fad. However, by fall of 1977, Star Wars had become a genuine sensation and could not be ignored. That convinced Paramount Studios that science fiction was where the money was, and the success of Star Wars, Paramount called in all their top executives to a big meeting to demand ideas on how to cash in on this Star Wars phenomenon. They ordered their top guys to create a similar Star Wars-like franchise, and one of the producers raised their hands and reminded the executive that Paramount already owned a Star Wars-like franchise called Star Trek. Immediately, Star Trek Phase 2, the TV show, was canceled. And 2 weeks later, an official high-budget Star Trek feature film was greenlit. Fact number 2, Robert Wise was hired as director to control Gene Roddenberry. So we need to talk about Gene Roddenberry's complicated character. Back during the days before Star Trek the original series, Gene Roddenberry was known as a kind and gentle and brilliant man who had a lot of insecurities. And at that time, his insecurities made him more sympathetic and endearing. However, we all know what can happen to insecure people who suddenly become successful and get a little power. After Star Trek got on the air and Roddenberry began to get accolades, and he was referred to as the Great Bird of the Galaxy, people began to see him start to get a little bit of a sense of himself. And people that worked with him said that he was not as thoughtful and introspective about it as one would have hoped. It was here that he began to get into conflicts with the cast and the producers. He was still a visionary and brilliant storyteller, but he was also described as a very mediocre writer. He relied heavily on his scriptwriters like D.C. Fontana to turn his vision into that 60 to 70 page teleplay. And Gene Roddenberry knew absolutely nothing about the practical day-to-day operations of filming a TV show or a movie. Now, by the time Star Trek the Motion Picture was filming, Gene Roddenberry was reveling in his own reputation and success. To Gene, he was the Great Bird of the Galaxy, and no one could tell him otherwise. He would frequently get into conflicts with other filmmakers, especially other screenwriters, and he became very unmanageable. It was his way or the highway, and people who worked with him described him as being very difficult to work with. He was still generous and magnanimous toward his legions of fans, but if you were a working colleague, it was very different. According to people who had worked with him, whenever he met someone new in Hollywood, it was as if he'd look for a reason to get in an argument with them. You were either an adoring fan or you were the enemy. There was really no middle ground. For director, they hired legendary Academy Award-winning director Robert Wise. This was an odd choice because Robert Wise was not a Star Trek fan, and he was completely unfamiliar with the TV show. Despite this, Robert Wise was considered a very safe director to helm this project. So why Robert Wise? Why did Paramount choose a man who was not a Star Trek fan and more associated with movies like The West Side Story and The Sound of Music? Well, this is because Paramount began to see what they called the Gene Roddenberry problem. Roddenberry would often insert himself and attempt to exert control over the production. So from Paramount's point of view, he was often the problem getting in the way of the movie's production. However, Gene Roddenberry had a favorite science fiction movie, and his favorite movie of all time was The Day the Earth Stood Still, directed by Robert Wise. Paramount hoped that by hiring his idol to direct Star Trek, and that would be a way of controlling Roddenberry and stop him from interfering with the production. And it worked, at least in the beginning of the production. Fact number 3, Robert Wise's wife and daughter probably saved Star Trek. Robert Wise was not a Star Trek fan, but his wife, his daughter, and his son-in-law were huge fans. When his wife read the script, she first asked, "Where's Spock?" Wise explained that Leonard Nimoy was not returning, and she said, "Without Spock, there is no Star Trek." And what really impressed Robert Wise was how vehemently his daughter and son-in-law agreed. And Robert Wise realized that they needed Leonard Nimoy. He had Paramount settle their disputes with Leonard Nimoy, pay him what he was asking for, and signed him for the movie. Unfortunately for David Gattro, this meant that Zahn was out. When Leonard Nimoy initially refused to reprise the role of Spock for Star Trek Phase 2, Gene Roddenberry created the character of Zahn, who was a full-blooded Vulcan in Starfleet. However, unlike Spock, who endeavored to be more Vulcan, Zahn was fascinated with humans and wanted to learn more about human emotions. And David Gattro was hired for the role of Zahn. Unfortunately, fans did not take to Zahn, or rather, were probably just upset that Spock would not be in Star Trek Phase 2 and took it out on poor David Gattro. But fans were not kind about it. He even received letters threatening to poison him if he didn't quit. So yeah, that really happened. When Robert Wise was brought on to direct and advocated for the hiring of Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry continued to advocate for David Gattro to play Zahn over Leonard Nimoy's Spock. And at one point, while Paramount was negotiating with Leonard Nimoy, Gene Roddenberry had a conversation with David Gattro, assuring him not to worry, that the role of Zahn was guaranteed, and that Paramount still wanted him over Leonard Nimoy. But then a few days later, Paramount settled their dispute with Nimoy, and Gattro was out. However, they were able to give Gattro a small role as Commander Branch, head of Space Station Epsilon 9, the one that gets destroyed by V'ger at the beginning of the movie. During this time, Leonard Nimoy approached David Gattro and had a frank conversation about him replacing Zahn and helped David Gattro process the loss of the role. David Gattro thought it was a very kind gesture and very wise of Leonard Nimoy to do something like that, and always appreciated it. Fact number 4. Paramount wanted special effects like that of Star Wars, and this will eventually haunt them. Paramount first went to Douglas Trumbull. Trumbull had a great reputation in Hollywood, and he had just done the special effects for 2001: A Space Odyssey and was known as the best special effects guy in Hollywood. Paramount went to Douglas Trumbull and offered him the job of Star Trek the Motion Picture. However, he declined because he wanted to do his own project, so Paramount needed to hire a special effects company. They accepted bids from various special effects companies all over town, and a production company called Able and Associates, headed by Robert Able, won the bid with the offer of $4 million. Robert Able was known mostly for being a documentary filmmaker. However, he sold himself to Paramount as a special effects company. This decision to use Able and Associates is going to haunt Robert Wise for months, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Fact number 5. The new USS Enterprise was a sleek work of art. The USS Enterprise had to be redesigned for the big screen. The production crew was given a budget of $150,000 to redesign and create the new starship. The model was 8 foot long, and the larger size allowed many more details, and the warp nacelles would look sleeker, and it was also made with a lightweight aluminum, so the entire model only weighed 85 pounds. With the television Enterprise, the dorsal neck supports would weaken and shake. This time, they were reinforced with strong aluminum, which allowed the 8-foot model to be very sturdy and allowed movement without any weakening. Everyone was very pleased with the new Enterprise, and it was an amazing design. Fact number 6. The new uniforms were notoriously uncomfortable. Gene Roddenberry wanted to redesign the costumes because he felt that the miniskirts, which may have been exciting for 1960, were too sexist, so he wanted to create a more modern look between the genders. Robert Wise also did not like the uniforms because he did not like the bright Technicolor costumes. Those bright colors work well on the small TV screen during the advent of television, but on the big screen, he worried that they would look too garish and distracting. Also, Wise was looking for verisimilitude. Bright red, yellow, and blue costumes just looked too fake. He wanted the uniforms to look realistic enough and resemble military uniforms. Therefore, he muted the colors to the more realistic pastel earth tones of gray, beige, and sky blue. And it's probably no coincidence that the color palette matches the earth tones of Star Wars, while other fans notice a similarity between the uniforms of Star Trek the Motion Picture and the 1975 television series Space 1999. However, these new uniforms were notoriously uncomfortable, and William Shatner later joked that the costumes fit like pajamas and showed every flaw. Fact number 7, the screenplay was being rewritten as the movie was being shot. Robert Wise had an unusual problem. The screenplay was not completed. It was being written while the movie was being shot, and the ending wasn't even close to being finished. It was almost 2 months into filming, and the production still didn't have an ending to the movie. They had an Act 1 and Act 2, but they did not have an Act 3. None of the writers could come up with a working ending. Robert Wise went to everyone, including the cast, for suggestions on how to end the movie. Even William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy gave suggestions, but none of their ideas were really usable. It was John Povil who saved the day. Povil used to be Gene Roddenberry's assistant until Harold Livingston made him story editor and associate producer. John Povil came up with the idea that V'ger needed to evolve and bond with its creator, and the movie could end with Will Decker merging with Ilia, hence merging with V'ger, to create a new powerful sentient being that would fly off to explore new dimensions. While many didn't like this ending, Robert Wise liked it. It was good enough, and the ending was approved on December of 1978. Fact number 8, Jerry Goldsmith's iconic score elevated the movie. The musical score was composed by legendary composer Jerry Goldsmith, and Jerry Goldsmith hit gold with the new Star Trek theme. Gene Roddenberry liked the theme so much that he decided to use it for a Star Trek Next Generation TV show. He will go on to compose the themes to Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, Star Trek First Contact, Star Trek Insurrection, Star Trek Nemesis, as well as other films like Alien, Rambo First Blood Part 2, Rambo 3, Total Recall, Air Force One, Rudy, The Mummy, and many, many more. Fact number 9, creating the special effects almost destroyed the filmmakers. As the due date of the movie approached, Robert Wise went to Able and Associates and demanded to see what footage they had. And according to reports, Able and Associates were having trouble delivering the special effects. It had almost been 10 months and millions of dollars spent, and they created almost no usable footage. Robert Able was a loud, talkative man who dominated the room, and he was known to make a lot of promises. Many people in Hollywood consistently described him with one word: salesman. He impressed Paramount with lots of excellent ideas, but had no way of delivering them. It turned out that Able and Associates were not experienced at special effects, and he had overpromised and did not know how to create the special effects needed for the movie. Robert Able was clearly in over his head. He not only spent the $4 million bid, but an extra $1 million that was not initially authorized. He spent a total of $5 million of Paramount's money trying unsuccessfully to learn how to do the job. Abel and Associates had created zero usable footage. The usually calm Robert Wise flipped out and is supposedly to have said, "I don't want to see that SOB ever again." Paramount fired Abel and Associates and had to start completely from scratch. They did not have 1 second's worth of usable film and wasted $5 million of precious money, but Paramount had to cut their losses, and this would further inflate the budget by tens of millions of dollars. And with no usable special effects, Paramount was forced to go to Douglas Trumbull, and fortunately, Trumbull needed Paramount to do his own solo project, and Paramount played a hardball. They demanded he work on this project or they would never work in Hollywood again. Trumbull reluctantly accepted, and Trumbull was given the task of completing the special effects in only 6 months, starting with nothing. Trumbull went to John Dykstra, founder of ILM, who did the special effects for Star Wars, and asked for help. They split into 2 teams and went immediately to work. Douglas Trumbull and his team started with the introduction of the Enterprise, where Scotty and Kirk see the new ship. Meanwhile, John Dykstra's team started with the Klingon ships that were being electrified by V'ger. Then Douglas Trumbull and his team began work on the inside of V'ger, and his team accomplished this by using multiple layers of matte paintings. It was years before CGI. The effects are beautiful and haunting. And Doug Trumbull and John Dykstra and Robert Wise went into crisis mode, and they worked 7 days a week, 24 hours a day for 6 straight months. And each team broke up into 8-hour shifts, working 24 hours a day, and even brought cots into their offices so they could sleep and then work. It was an amazing Herculean effort. Doug Trumbull, John Dykstra finished the job in 6 months. And what you see on screen is the Herculean effort by these 2 cinematic geniuses. They did a phenomenal job, but apparently it was at a great physical and mental cost. Douglas Trumbull had insomnia and ulcers, and even ended up in the hospital immediately after completion of the film. Fact number 10, Star Trek was an expensive, rushed premiere with an unfinished print. At the end of production, the initial $16 million had ballooned to $46 million, which is worth $193 million when adjusted for inflation, and was the most expensive movie to date. But Paramount didn't really care at this point because they were more worried about the potential lawsuit, a possible $100 million lawsuit if they didn't deliver this movie on time. Meanwhile, Robert Wise continued to edit the film in order to make the December 7th release date. The Paramount executives told him, "I don't care if this movie has black tape where the special effects are supposed to be. I need a cut of this film in the theaters by December 7th. Robert Wise was editing the film as late as December 5th, 2 days before the release of the film, and he didn't even have time to dry the film. When the actual film arrived at the premiere, it was still wet from the processing, and Robert Wise just assumed correctly that the film would dry while being played in the projectors. On the days before December 9th, hundreds of wet cans of film were individually shipped to all the theaters across the country. And Robert Wise hand-held the canister of film to the Hollywood premiere. Paramount didn't care if the movie was good or bad. They were just happy that they made the December 7th date, and they would not be sued. In fact, they were quite expecting the movie to be a disaster. However, during the Hollywood premiere, the scene with the 3 Klingon ships, the audience broke out in applause. And so Paramount realized that maybe they might have a surprise hit on their hands. Bonus fact, Star Trek the Motion Picture was a hit that saved Star Trek. To everyone's surprise, Star Trek the Motion Picture went on to set a record-breaking box office, making $11.8 million in its opening weekend and made a total of $139 million overall. That's $600 million when adjusted for inflation. Also, it ended up being nominated for 3 Academy Awards: Best Art Direction, Best Visual Effects, and Best Original Score. It was a surprise success, but it did get mixed reviews. Everyone loved the special effects and thought it was stunning. Most critics just thought it was way too boring, and someone dubbed it the slow motion picture. But no one could deny the monetary success of the movie, and that guaranteed that another Star Trek movie would be made. Star Trek was back and better than ever. However, they did recognize how close they came to complete disaster. Paramount needed a fall guy, and that fall guy was Gene Roddenberry. After all, he was the producer on the film and wasn't exactly seen as someone that helped solve the problem, but rather contributed to it. And therefore he was removed from all the sequels and would be kicked upstairs and given the role of creative consultant. That meant that he got to see everything that was made and was allowed to make suggestions, but no one was under any obligation to listen to him. Robert Wise was seen as a hero that averted disaster. However, he was exhausted and so burned out by his experience on this film that he took a break from directing for 10 years. He returned to directing in 1989 and directed a film called Rooftops. In 2001, Paramount Pictures went to Robert Wise and allowed him to go back and re-edit this film. Now the scenes flow much better, new special effects were added. The planet Vulcan looks much better. We get to see the external body of V'ger, and when the crew meet V'ger, the scene looks far more epic. This is now seen as the definitive version of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Now please join us next time as we talk about the sequel, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Well, that ends my video on the making of Star Trek the Motion Picture. And if you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. It only takes a second, but it really helps me out. And I'm curious, are you a fan of Star Trek the Motion Picture? Well, tell me about it. Don't forget to leave a comment telling me what you thought of this movie. That ends this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you had a great time.